From a high-stakes corporate standoff at a Mexican deepwater port to a record-breaking push for childcare funding that's being shadowed by a $325 million fraud problem, the House floor yesterday proved that bipartisanship and bitter conflict often share the same breathing space. It's a study in legislative contradictions.
The calendar for April 6th looks like a collection of opposing energies. On one side, you have members from across the aisle joining forces to take on a foreign government over a rock quarry. Then, moments later, they're circling the wagons over how much oversight is too much for programs that help families pay for childcare. There's a great deal of nuance to sift through in the record this morning.
Welcome to Floor Notes for Tuesday, April 7th, 2026.
And I'm Reed. We're digging into the Congressional Record from yesterday. And Paige, that Mexican port story is the only place to start. It reads like a geopolitical thriller, but it's actually a trade dispute that's been simmering for years, involving military intervention and international treaties.
Exactly. We're talking about Vulcan Materials Company. They're based in Alabama, but they operate massive facilities in Mexico, specifically a limestone quarry and a deepwater port on the Yucatan Peninsula called Punta Venado. For years, the Mexican government, starting under former President López Obrador, has been trying to take control of it. Yesterday, Democratic Representative Vicente Gonzalez of Texas went to the floor to signal that the U.S. patience has effectively run out.
This goes beyond one company's bottom line. The argument being made on the floor is that this serves as a fundamental test of the USMCA, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA. If a signatory can simply walk in and seize a billion-dollar American asset, the treaty's protections are essentially hollow. I was looking into the specific legislation Gonzalez was advocating for, the Defending American Property Abroad Act. What's the actual teeth in that bill, Paige?
The bill is surprisingly aggressive. It's led by Republican Representative August Pfluger of Texas. But as we saw yesterday, it has a very distinct bipartisan flavor. The core mechanism is a retaliatory threat. If a foreign government, and the bill is drafted with Mexico clearly in its sights, seizes American property without due process and fair compensation, there are immediate consequences. We're talking about docking bans. It would effectively bar any vessels using that seized port from entering U.S. ports. It creates a legislative no-fly list for cargo ships.
The language Gonzalez used in the record really highlights those stakes. He said, and I'm reading from the transcript, Mexico's ongoing efforts to control a deepwater port owned by U.S.-based Vulcan Material Company not only puts American jobs at risk, but it is a direct violation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. He followed that up by saying, we must enact proper safeguards to provide our businesses the certainty needed to operate without fear of unlawful asset or property seizure.
That word, certainty, is the anchor for these trade debates. Businesses can model for risk, but they cannot model for a government that changes the rules mid-game. And the history here is wild. The Mexican government initially claimed they were moving in for environmental reasons, but then the rhetoric shifted to turning the quarry into a tourist park or using the port for their national Maya train project. At one point, the Mexican military actually entered the property to secure it for a different company. If you're a U.S. investor, you aren't just looking at Vulcan. You're looking at the safety of every dollar you have in the region.
Significant, too, is the fact that even with the leadership change in Mexico, the pressure hasn't let up. That's why you see someone like Gonzalez, a Democrat from a border district who usually prioritizes a productive relationship with Mexico, taking such a hard line. He's framing it as a fundamental rule of law issue. He said, with this bill, we will reinforce the rule of law, protect our supply chains, and assure that American businesses continue to create jobs.
It's also a supply chain story that hits closer to home than people realize. We aren't talking about simple gravel. It's high-quality limestone used for major infrastructure projects all over the U.S. Gulf Coast. If that supply is cut off or redirected, it ripples through the cost of American highways and bridges. So, you have this rare moment where the Chamber of Commerce crowd and the national security hawks are standing on the same side of the line. But Reed, as much as they agreed on that, The mood shifted the second the conversation turned to domestic spending.
It really did. Let's talk about what I'm calling the childcare integrity paradox. This is a quintessential Capitol Hill standoff where everyone agrees on the goal, but the fight starts the second someone opens the spreadsheet. Yesterday, the House saw a flurry of activity regarding the Child Care and Development Block Grant, the CCDBG. This is the primary vehicle the federal government uses to help low-income families afford childcare, so parents can work or attend school.
The paradox is the scale of the request versus the scale of the problem. On one hand, you have 156 Democrats and 40 Republicans signing on to letters asking for record-high funding for this program. They're pointing to massive waitlists and the fact that childcare costs are outstripping inflation. But at the exact same time, Republican Representative Tim Walberg of Michigan filed 8 separate reports targeting fraud and improper payments in that very same program.
8 reports is a loud statement. Walberg is focusing on a specific figure that the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, has been flagging: $325 million. That was the estimated amount of improper payments in the CCDBG program in just one fiscal year. The improper payment rate is climbing toward 5%, which is what landed the program on the GAO's high-risk list. For the GAO, high risk means the program is particularly vulnerable to fraud, waste, or mismanagement.
5% might sound manageable until you realize we're talking about billions of dollars in total. The catalyst for this urgency was that massive fraud case in Minnesota, the Feeding Our Future scandal, where hundreds of millions were diverted. Even though that was a food program, it became the blueprint for how these block grants can be exploited.
Which sounds like a simple solution: verify eligibility before sending the check. But the tension in the record shows that the states, who actually run these programs, fear that adding more layers of verification will slow the process to a crawl. If you're a single parent starting a new job on Monday, you can't wait 6 weeks for a state auditor to verify your tax returns from 3 years ago. You need a daycare spot now. It's the classic tension between accountability and access.
Exactly. And Republicans like Walberg are countering that by saying, look, if we lose $325 million to fraud, that's money that isn't going to the families who actually qualify. It puts the program supporters in a difficult spot. It's hard to ask for a record-breaking budget increase when the current funds are being flagged for mismanagement. The timing here is purely tactical. These reports were filed just as the budget season is hitting high gear to give leverage to those who want to freeze or cut the funding levels.
It's a reflection of a broader trend we're seeing this session: this oversight as a precursor to funding. We aren't just seeing it with childcare. It's happening with DHS and education grants. The message from the majority is, we aren't giving you a dime more until you show us exactly where the last dime went. It's a high-friction way to govern, but it's become the standard operating procedure in the 119th Congress.
Moving on to that standard procedure, let's look at the House hopper from yesterday. This is where members drop in the bills they want to introduce. Usually it's a mix of the mundane and the massive, but yesterday had some real gems. We saw 15 new bills, ranging from serious budget work to base messaging at its most intense.
Let's start with the messaging. Democratic Representative John Larson of Connecticut introduced H.Res. 1155. It's a resolution to impeach former President Trump. Now, Paige, context matters here. We're in the 119th Congress. Republicans have the majority. This resolution has essentially a 0% chance of even getting a hearing, let alone a floor vote.
It's purely symbolic, but it highlights that even years later, the political friction hasn't dissipated. It's a way for Larson to signal to his constituents where he stands, even if the legislative path is a dead end. On the other side of the aisle, you have someone like Republican Representative Chip Roy of Texas. He isn't focused on symbolism, he's doing the plumbing. He's moving the needle on the FY 2026 budget, looking at the actual mechanics of how the government is going to fund itself next year.
Chip Roy is always about the plumbing, but it's high-pressure plumbing. He's pushing for specific cuts and procedural changes that would fundamentally change how the House handles spending bills. It's less flashy than an impeachment resolution, but it's more likely to affect how the building functions day to day. But then we have the most unique entry from yesterday's record.
I knew you were going to bring this up. We're talking about Representative Tim Burchett, the Republican from Tennessee.
Tim Burchett. He is a man of many interests, but he has become the unofficial UFO guy in Congress. He's been pushing for years for more transparency on what the government calls unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs. But yesterday he took a very Burchett approach to the problem. He introduced a bill to completely terminate the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO. That's the Pentagon's official unit for tracking and analyzing UFOs.
It seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? The person who wants the most information about UFOs wants to kill the office tasked with investigating them. What's the logic there?
It's a specific kind of skepticism. Burchett's argument, and he's been vocal about this, is that AARO isn't providing transparency. It's providing a cover for the Pentagon. He views them as a clearinghouse for denials rather than an investigative body. His move is basically, if you aren't going to tell us the truth, we aren't going to pay for your office. It's the ultimate, if I can't have it my way, I'm taking the ball home maneuver.
It fits into that broader GOP theme we were just talking about, with the child care grants, the deep skepticism of the administrative state. Whether it's a child care block grant or a secret Pentagon office, the reflex from the current majority is, if it's not working perfectly and transparently, it shouldn't exist. But it's a gamble, Reed. If you abolish the office, the data doesn't just become public. It just goes back into the black hole of the broader intelligence community, where there's even less oversight.
Exactly. Burchett is a provocateur. He knows this bill likely won't pass as a standalone, but it sends a massive signal to the Pentagon that their funding for these specific programs is on thin ice. It's also just such a human moment in the record. Amidst all the talk of international trade violations and multi-million-dollar fraud reports, you have a member of Congress essentially saying, I'm tired of the Pentagon's answers on space aliens, so I'm cutting their budget. It's why the record is so much more interesting than the headlines would suggest.
It really is. It's the difference between seeing the finished product of a bill and seeing the raw ingredients. Yesterday was a day of raw ingredients. You see the building blocks of the next trade war, the next budget fight, and the next cultural flashpoint, all being laid out in the space of a few hours.
It's also a reminder that for all the talk of gridlock, there is an immense amount of work happening. 15 bills introduced in one day, 8 oversight reports, floor speeches on international trade. The machinery is moving, even if it's moving in 10 different directions at once. That's the story of the 119th Congress so far. High activity, high friction, and very little middle ground.
And yet, you have that Vulcan Materials bill, a Republican bill supported by a Democrat to protect an American company. It shows that there are still these islands of consensus where the national interest, or at least the economic interest, overrides the partisan branding. If you look at the record, you see Gonzalez and Pfluger essentially reading from the same script.
No, it doesn't. It takes months of backroom work to get to that 5-minute floor speech. The overarching situation for today is watching to see if that Vulcan bill gets a floor vote. And we're keeping a very close eye on the CCDBG funding levels. If those oversight reports from Wahlberg start gaining traction, that record-high funding request for childcare might be in serious trouble.
It's all connected. The money, the oversight, the trade, and the UFOs. It's all part of the same 15-minute walk from the office to the chamber. And that's why we dig into these footnotes, Reed, because that's where the real story usually starts.
And speaking of those stories, we should probably wrap things up with a bit of a reality check. In a day filled with talk of securing property and tightening budgets, perhaps the most ironic moment came from Representative Tim Burchett. He's introduced a bill to kill the very Pentagon office tasked with investigating UFOs, proving that in Congress, sometimes the way to get more transparency is to simply delete the department in charge of it.
It's the ultimate Control-Alt-Delete approach to government. If you don't like the data, just delete the hard drive. I have to wonder if he's thought about what happens if the aliens actually show up and there's no one left to take the message.
I'm sure he'd say he'll just take the call himself. That's Floor Notes for today.
We'll see you next time. Stay informed out there and keep an eye on the skies, or at least the hopper.